Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this debate. And I just wanted to commend my colleague from Wascana on what I thought was an absolutely excellent outline of Canada's fiscal history. It indeed set out, and he was, in many measures, front and center in some very critical decisions of Canada's fiscal history in the last number of years, and I think we in the Liberal Party recognize his contributions. I don't know that how should we say, some colleagues across the way quite appreciate him in the way that we do. I think my honourable colleague says that's a fair comment. I wanted to start, Mr. Speaker, by talking about an article I read in Globe and Mail this week by a fellow named Crawley and Murphy. Mr. Crawley is a well-known Atlantic Canadian, and I would describe him, and I hope he sees the description in the same way, as very much a fiscal conservative. In fact, he's been working in the Department of Finance. And he's written a book, and the book talks about really what the U.S. Can learn from Canada's recent fiscal history, and particularly the period of time in which the Liberal government was in power. And he says that Canada faced an even larger fiscal crisis in the mid-1990s than America does today, and our achievement dwarfs anything being proposed in Washington. By acting decisively, Canada resolved its crisis quickly and with surprisingly little pain. Since the memory of this momentous achievement is fading or is unknown to the younger generation, and may I say colleagues opposite, it is worth recalling how it unfolded. In the mid-1990s, the Canadian federal government had been in a budget deficit for 2 decades. A third of all federal revenue was being frittered away on interest on the debt. A Wall Street Journal editorial actually, on January 12, 1995, declared that the country has, quote, now become an honorary member of the Third World in the unmanageability of its debt problem. It has lost its AAA credit rating and can't assume that lenders will be willing to refinance its growing debt. And may I add, as a parenthesis, my predecessor at Scarborough East had a lot to do with trying to keep Canada's AAA credit rating in some of the worst part of the 1995-96 crisis. Deliverance came from in the following month when the centre-left Liberal government tabled its historic budget. This document was a defining moment in Canada's fiscal history. More astonishing than the bold plans for a massive rollback was the fact that Ottawa actually did what the document said. Total spending fell by more than 7% over 2 years, while program spending, excluding interest, fell by almost 10%. As a share of the economy, federal spending fell from 22% to 19% during the same period. By January 1998, the federal employment was down to 51,000, about 14% less. Ottawa ran 11 consecutive surpluses beginning in 97-98, with the federal government paying down its debt and the recovery expanding. Total public debt plummeted over the following decade. It then goes on in the article to, in effect, prescribe medicine for the U.S. economy, and I don't pretend to or want to engage in that debate. But it is worth remembering that Canada was there and we are no longer there. And I just want to again point out that there was enormous political price to be paid by Prime Ministers Chrétien and Martin and the Liberal caucus and the Liberal Party. I came in 97. We came within 4 or 5 seats of actually losing a majority. And part of it had to do with the difficulties that this fiscal medicine we had to impose. No budget is ever presented in a political vacuum. And And in 1997, it was a very difficult environment for us. The rewriting and reinventing of political history by the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance is all part of a misinformation campaign by the Conservatives. The Conservatives inherited a $13 billion surplus and have, in a few short years, turned it into Canada's largest deficit in history, having run deficits ever since. They even brag that this year they'll have less of a deficit than they had last year. Or they brag about how we compare ourselves to other countries. Well, certainly we're doing terrific compared to Greece or Portugal or Spain or Italy. They don't quite mention that maybe we're not doing quite so hot when you compare yourself to Germany or Sweden or Norway, which is, of course, a petro economy. And there's a good reason why this is studied, Mr. Speaker, as a political economy, because political decisions can be good and they can also be bad. The political courage shown by Prime Ministers Chrétien and Martin and the Liberal caucus has brought Canada into a relative state of fiscal health, and the Prime Minister has been dining out on it ever since. Gutless political decisions such as cutting the GST have, for the foreseeable future, killed any chance of ever going into a fiscal balance. Politically gutless decisions such as ignoring your Confederation partners and refusing to meet with them creates Confederation chaos with premiers fighting with each other and with policy incoherence. Gutless political decisions that cater to the Conservatives' 35% base and ignore the rest is simply that, just creating anger and apathy. So how can a government says it knows how to manage the economy when the number of unemployed Canadians have risen 34% during its mandate? These 1.4 million unemployed Canadians are not impressed by the so-called management of the economy by the Conservatives. How can they say that during the last 4 years there's more unemployed people in agriculture and in construction and manufacturing and trade and still say, oh, well, we know how to manage the economy? Of course, Mr. Speaker, the answer is tax cuts. If you're unemployed, tax cuts. If you just had your pension locked off, well, I answer that as tax cuts. If you're bankrupt, oh, tax cuts, that's really going to work for you. If your industry has been devastated, well, tax cuts, that's going to be the answer. You got cancer, well, that's tax cuts. Unrest in the Middle East, well, tax cuts. You know, it's simply, Mr. Speaker, the Mitt Romney robo answer to all our ills. Tax cuts will save us for everything. Doesn't anyone ever ask themselves the fundamental question of how we got ourselves into this mess in the first place? So Crowley and Murphy are right in the sense that the U.S. could look to Chrétien and Martin for inspiration, but I'm perfectly prepared to admit that the political and economic contexts are quite different. I think this motion should be supported. However, it would be more supportable if its author didn't go around creating his own chaos, calling the premiers the Prime Minister's messengers and remaining mute on various issues that are of great national interest erodes your credibility when presenting a motion such as this. In his own trips, refusing actually to meet premiers, again, erodes his credibility with respect to the presentation of this motion. The NDP has, and the Conservatives rightly say, opposed every free trade agreement. You can't be a credible economic leader unless, in fact, you do deal with various opportunities to create trade in this country. The Prime Minister does need to consult with the premiers, and he does need to do it much more quickly. He does need to do it, and therefore we in the Liberal caucus will, in fact, be supporting this motion, Mr. Speaker. I thank you for your time.
Questions and comments? The Minister for Canadian Heritage and Official Languages.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I mean, I suppose a short question. I like the member from Scarborough very much. I respect, obviously, his time in this House and his observations on many issues. He used some He used some pretty strong language, though, I have to say, suggesting that our government was, quote, politically gutless. Well, politically gutless, I think, is perhaps something that would be better attributed to a political party that got elected saying it would scrap, kill, and abolish the GST and then did none of those things, versus a political party like ours which said that we would reduce the GST and actually follow through on our platform commitment. However, one has to wonder, though, and I'll give him an opportunity certainly to respond to it in this regard, is that if our record of economic management is so appalling and so awful and so, quote, politically gutless, I just have to ask the member opposite, why did the Liberal Party and why did he vote for Conservative Budget 2009, Conservative Budget 2010, and all the Conservative Ways and Means motions to put those budgets in place? If it's so awful, if it's so terrible, then why was he so politically gutless in voting for it?
Member for Scarborough-Guildwood.
Mr. Speaker, only a Conservative could turn what is an awful economic situation and say this is wonderful. Mr. Speaker, they have taken $90 billion out of the fiscal framework and said, look what good boys are we. Haven't we done a terrific job? We are now running endless deficits, Mr. Speaker, and we know how to manage the economy. Well, Mr. Speaker, a politically gutsy Prime Minister would, in fact, get himself back into fiscal sustainability sooner rather than later. But at this point, there is no hope that we will, in fact, achieve balance.
Questions and comments? The member from Parkdale High Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his comments, and I thank he and the previous speaker from his party for their support for our call for the federal government to meet with the territorial and provincial leaders at the upcoming meeting this fall. And I do want to recognize that during a previous government led by that party, by his party, that was a period of very dramatic spending cuts, some of the deepest social spending cuts in the history of the country, that a former Prime Minister Bragg took us back to the spending levels of the 1950s, and that pollution increased to unprecedented levels under that government. However, my question to him is, does he support the position of our party and the position of the Leader of the official opposition that in matters concerning the environment, does he support the basic principle of polluter pay? Does he support that principle in that motion?
The member from Scarborough-Guildwood.
Mr. Speaker, you'll remember that one of the former leaders of our party actually put forward this in the context of an election, and there's absolutely no doubt that you have to price carbon. There's no issue about that. We felt that there was a particular approach that could be taken that price carbon. We have policy incoherence in this country because there are provinces that actually price carbon. But again, on the theme of gutlessness, this party opposite will not approach this and actually spreads misinformation about my colleague's party on this very issue. So, you know, if you're not going to, you have to price carbon. If you won't price carbon, then we continue on the political incoherence that currently exists and is regrettable and certainly something that should be taken up at a Premier's leaders conference. Thank you.
Member from Winnipeg North, question and comment.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm wondering if my colleague would comment on the vacuum of strong national leadership that emanates from the government benches and from the New Democratic Party. On the government side, they see no value in terms of having First Minister meetings. On the from the New Democratic Party, there seems to be this divisive attitude and dismissal attitude of premiers and the roles that they actually play. And I wonder if he can provide comment in terms of, because he has been a part of a majority government, of the value of actually having a First Minister's meet, where you have the federal government sitting down working with provincial premiers.
From Scarborough, Guildwood, very quickly, you're out of time.
I just want to paint a contrast, Mr. Speaker, between how Prime Ministers Chrétien and Martin handled things and how this current Prime Minister handles things, and frankly, the NDP leader handles things. During the, and I remember it very clearly, over here across the street in the old railway building, the Prime Minister sitting down with the premiers and negotiating over a number of days the transfers, particularly for health care transfers and social transfers, and setting out a 10-year time frame so that the premiers could understand and would be and would recognize that this is the amount of funding that would get transferred to them. That settled Confederation issues for many years. That's the way to do things. It is not the way it is wrong to dismiss them, and it is wrong to not meet with them.